So you just got a little snippet of a couple ways that a musician from a Western classical tradition and an Indian classical tradition can collaborate. Now, you might be wondering, why is this of interest? This has been done many times, perhaps most famously and perhaps the first time between Ravi Shankar and Yehudi Menuhin. But many times since then, and one of the reasons is to show solidarity between cultures, to show an understanding. Certainly for me, it was my job for the 4 years when I lived in Afghanistan, teaching at Afghanistan National Institute of Music. I thought I was going there just to teach violin. I also taught viola, cello, bass, harmony, managed the website, arranged the tours, wrote the speeches, the concept papers, arranged music for the orchestra, conducted the orchestra, arranged music for the faculty. So it was a lot of different jobs bundled into one. And frequently I would be asked to arrange for the orchestra an Afghan patriotic song or an Afghan folk song, or an Indo-Afghan classical music. Now, and this is an important political point in an age of increasing sensitivity. I've learned from playing in India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. If you're in India, this is called Indian classical music, and what most of the world knows it as, or Hindustani. In Pakistan, it's South Asian classical music, and in Afghanistan, Indo-Afghan. Indo-Afghan, and the reason for that being an Afghan king of the 18th century brought musicians from India. And so in Afghanistan, a young person who is learning their classical music is essentially learning the same thing as anyone learning classical music in New Delhi or Kolkata. It's the same system of rags and talas, and frequently India, when it has been possible to do so, sends teachers to Kabul and to other cities in Afghanistan, because the traditions, the theory is essentially the same. And some of the instruments are the same, some are different in Afghanistan. They like the rubab a lot and consider it the national instrument. But young Afghan musicians also learn sitar, they learn sarud and sarangi and dilruba. Tabla, of course. Can't go without tabla. And in many genres of Afghan music, just like in India, the tabla is always there, whether it's classical, semi-classical, popular, folk, the tabla is there. And there are many opportunities and challenges to these kinds of collaborations, but the one that I find both the easiest to understand at first glance and also the trickiest to master is the difference between a conception of rhythm. And it's something that I teach in Mexico, where I currently live. I teach Western classical music, and I actually find that I wish that more Western classical musicians would have the opportunity to work with tabla or to work with sitar, because what tends to happen to us is we live in various kinds of prisons, one of which has 5 bars. It's the pentagram, the 5-line staff. And I sometimes think of composers, great composers like Bach, as like those mad scientists from the 19th century with their butterfly nets trying to catch butterflies. And Bach has this amorphous and beautiful and multidimensional, multicolored thing in his mind, and he has to sort of trap it, pin it on the wall, put it, metaphorically speaking, into this prison of the 5-line staff, and then the meters that we use. And these meters are another kind of prison, because the beats are vertical. They're vertically felt. You go to an orchestra concert and you see a conductor marking time like this. Well, this is just for the convenience of the musicians, and actually, even among Western classical musicians, I find it's only the better ones who actually feel these 4 beats differently. What you find, especially with a lot of students sometimes, is the sense that every single beat is vertically imposed, which makes feeling the kind of freedom that many composers of Western classical music often intended rather difficult. And what I found so freeing about the musical tradition that Dibyarka represents so beautifully, I first encountered this tradition in 2006. I was concertmaster of the Spokane Symphony, went to a concert by Gaurav Mazumdar, you know him, wonderful sitar player. And to give you an example, too, of the cultural differences, not just between India and a country like the United States, but between Indian classical music and Western classical music. So I go up to him, this young kid he's never met. He's a very famous sitar player. And I said, I'd really love to learn more about your music. And without any hesitation, he said, certainly, come to my hotel room tomorrow at 8 a.m. And I did. And he had pictures of Ravi Shankar set up everywhere and proceeded to give me a fascinating 2-hour lesson for free, never mentioned charging me, on Indian classical music. And I thought about the reverse situation of Pinkas Zukerman giving a concert, and some kid goes up to him and says, I'd love to learn more about Bach or Beethoven. I don't think Zukerman would say, come to my hotel at 8 a.m. and I'll give you a lesson for 2 hours for free. And I also doubt that he would have had pictures of Dorothy DeLay, his teacher, plastered all over his hotel room. So that initiation was a really beautiful one. And then I proceeded to found a cultural diplomacy nonprofit, Cultures in Harmony, which promotes cultural understanding through music. And we did a project in Pakistan in 2009. So that was yet another set of positive experiences. And then moving to Afghanistan, this music became the bread and butter of what I did, because in that music school, we had an Afghan department and a Western department. And the 2 departments were expected to collaborate. I was in the Western department, and in the Afghan department, you had teachers of rubab, sitar, tabla, sarud. And one of the things I learned, and that I really took to this, I really find this liberating, and I wish more Western classical musicians would study Indian classical music, is this idea that the rhythm, instead of being this vertically imposed prison, is more felt horizontally. that over time you add things up. And in a second, Dibyarka will explain that. But to give you yet more context for why I think this would be so helpful for Western classical musicians to learn from, about 20 years ago, I had a question for a man who was then a very famous violinist in contemporary Western classical music, Paul Zukovsky. He was so famous that he had an assistant, and I spoke primarily with his assistant and asked her out of curiosity, and what is Mr. Zukovsky working on these days? And she said, oh, he's doing this project where he removes all the bar lines from Schubert minuets. And as an 18-year-old Juilliard student, I think I'd thought, well, this is a sign of obvious eccentricity from this famous man. But the more I think about it, the more I realize what a genius idea. Because in Western classical music, we do have this conception of these beats that are imposed from above. And if a conductor goes like this, beating 4, well, there are many occasions where actually a conductor will beat the music in 1. So you, as an audience member, even if you don't know classical music, you see a person standing up there imposing the vertical beats. And so increasingly, and this is what I've tried to put into my composition as well, I think we can learn something from this horizontal idea of rhythm. So Dibyarka, maybe if you could give our audience more of an idea of what that means.
Sure,
rhythm.
yeah. There's a very beautiful quote by one of the greatest maestros of Indian classical music of the 20th century. His name was Pandit Nikhil Banerjee. He was a man of few words, but this one really sticks in my mind. When he was asked, what is the idea behind Indian classical music? What is the main essence of it? And he said, the idea is to find the limitless within the limited, to find the infinite within the finite. So how that translates to rhythm is because at first glance, we have a very rigid structure that all rhythm is based on, the structure being tala, right? So why would it be restrictive? Because at any given tempo, which is being specified by the flow of music, the tabla player and the other musicians who are performing, they all have an idea about the structure of the rhythmic cycle that's cycling, and that creates two finite sort of bounds. One is the rhythm itself, and the second thing in terms of space or time, we have a finite amount of time that's being looped over and over. So both would seem to create a very real constraint on what could be expressed within that. And the purpose and the training that an Indian classical musician, definitely percussionist, goes through over the years and decades, I should say, is to find and have all of the tools at their disposal to create the illusion that those restrictions and structures no longer exist, to create a sense of freedom and really feel that, even though that we're bound by the number of beats that are looping at any given tempo and the amount of time that is specified as a result of that. So to give you an example, we kind of, we were doing it as in those pieces, but just to give you some examples of that. So if I was going to demonstrate the tal that is most common in North Indian classical music called teen tal, this would be a melodic representation of it. And the structure is very simple. It's 16 beats divided into 4 bars or measures, each containing 4 beats. So that melody is meant to keep reference of the tal. One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 15, 16. Dha, din, din, dha, dha, din, din, dha, na, tin, tin, ta, ta, din, din, dha. So what I just recited are the drum syllables, the bowls that we can play on the drums. Din, da. Can I request you to keep the tali kali? Just the tali kali. Da, din, din. You can all join. 1, 2, 3. The wave is on the 9 beat. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So I'll play. So this is gonna remain the base layer of rhythm. And then slowly I'm gonna add other layers of rhythm until, if you didn't have that, you would forget that this base layer exists, even though it does in my mind. What was happening there is I'm adding layers and layers of rhythm while maintaining the bottom layer at all times. So this is the idea behind Indian classical music. What you're hearing most of the time is not the actual rhythmic expression of the tal, even though the tal is always an undercurrent. So if I was to analyze what I just did, which was totally improvised, I would say I probably created a base layer of triplets on top of the 4. And then I doubled that, so it became 6s on top of 4s. And then it became 12s on top of 4s. Once you get to the 12 level, then you have this wonderful choice between either 3 4s or 4 3s. So I was highlighting the different rhythms of that. And then it can go into 24s and other, So that's just one direction. And I could have gone in a 7 direction or 8 direction or 9 direction. So this is the beauty of the multi-level multi-layered rhythm.
And I should add to what you just said, a lot of times Indian classical music, there can be sometimes a participation from the audience. At least I noticed in Afghanistan, after a particularly complicated TIE or pattern, that you land on the sam, and the audience is thinking, wait, how is this going to land on the sam a little bit? And when it does, sometimes they'll actually clap, like after a jazz solo. It's not like Western classical where you just have to wait till the end to clap. And sometimes, I don't know how common
You should
this...
explain what he's talking about. So the sum is the first beat of the cycle.
Yeah, sorry.
He's basically an Indian as far as the musical knowledge goes. So
the first beat.
So what he's referring to, that the way that I ended is that I'm constantly keeping track of that 16 beat cycle, and whatever I'm doing, ultimately, if it's building to a rhythmic climax, it's going to resolve back on the one. So there is an incredible amount of math involved in the higher aesthetics of it also. That now we're thinking in terms of 16 multiplied by 3, multiplied by 12. So how do we figure out a way that we can have a phrase, for example, at the high, which is a rhythmic movement, which is a phrase repeated 3 times, and the third time, the very last syllable of the high will resolve on the 1. Right, so there's a lot of advanced math going on.
Oh yeah, and when the audience is aware of that and appreciates it, I remember things that would happen in Kabul. I don't know how common this is outside Kabul, but like the students at the music school where I taught, they would call out "Kya baate?"
Yes.
What does "Kya baate" mean?
What a thing! Like amazing, amazing. Yeah.
Like isn't that what a thing? Isn't that amazing? And there are other little expressions that they might call out or clap or something, but it's particularly impressive because it's quite complicated, actually. I know enough to understand exactly how complicated it is, and it can be very intimidating. I remember one of the times I went back to Kabul after leaving in 2015. The Rubab teacher, Ramin Sakizada, he said, we are going to do a rag in 9.5 beats, and that was very tricky because, and I notated it, but in Western classical music, you don't, in my Sibelius computer notation program, there's no 9.5, so I ended up writing it as 19.8. Which tal is that, the 9.5? Champak tal or something like that? I don't remember what it was called. Chaptak... no, I'm not going to remember this. But it was, once I wrote it down... it was understandable to me, but the idea behind the training that you have to go through to be able to do that sort of calculation in your head on the go is tricky. Another aspect of the training that's so different, and perhaps you could demonstrate this for us. I love how the tabla students are expected to be able to say these patterns and then play them. And that would be so useful in Western classical music, because I have a lot of students in Mexico who have challenges with even simple rhythms. And I think if they were forced from the very beginning that, no, you have to say this perfectly, then play it, maybe their rhythm would be better. So can you show us an example of a pattern that you say and then play?
Yeah, it's a very unique thing. So India, for those who are unfamiliar, India actually has 2 different classical systems. So we have a system in the north, which is called Hindustani, and we have a system in the south, which is called Carnatic. So both systems originate from the same the principles, which is based on raga and tala. But the way that the North Indian system has evolved, especially in the last 300 years or 400 years, is that the percussions have this extensive vocabulary, or what I would say language, that corresponds to everything that we are playing. So in Carnatic music, all rhythmic patterns and things are kind of perceived numerically. They have simple syllables, taka, dim, for example, but those are not corresponding to specific touches on the percussions, which is different from North. For example, if I say na, that implies to any tabla student this sound, this particular sound on this surface. If I say tin, it's this, right? So tin would never be played here, na would never be played there. te, te. Ti, ta. Thun. Right? So combination strokes. Dha, te, te, dha, te, te. Dha is a combination of na and the ke, right? So dhagena, dhati, dhagena. Treke, dhete, dhati, dhagena, dha. Dhere, dhere, kere, tak. Dhene, tere, kere, tak. So everything that I was playing before in the improvisation has a syllabic notation for it, which you could study, we could notate it, you could recite it. So small example of that, layering effect, right? So if I was going to keep the teen tal rhythm on my hands and say a tabla composition on top of that, so that would be something like this. So dha, dha, thun, thun, na, na, te, 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 ka, te, te, ka, te, te, ka, te, dha, 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 ka, te, dha. See how that pattern that repeated 3 times, da 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 da. The very last one landed back on the sum, right? So that would be. So we, as students, we learn how to recite everything and internalize it as a language, just as much as we practice how to apply it on the instrument, so that we can have almost musical conversations at the end of the day. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was this sort of musical conversation that I wanted to embody in this piece. So I should explain, perhaps, because I'm hoping that all of you will come back on Saturday or Sunday for the premiere of this piece. The beginning of this piece was really, I've always been inspired by the life of Gandhi, and so in 2016, 2017, I was reading his autobiography and quite struck by the passage where he mentions that when he was a student in London in the late 1880s, he actually bought a violin, and not just randomly. I mean, he for 6 months was taking lessons, and I was very confused by this because I thought, what if Gandhi had had a really good teacher? And what if he'd really taken to it and decided, I'm going to become a violinist, and stayed in London? I mean, I do believe India would have eventually become independent, but not with his name attached to it, perhaps, and who knows when, earlier, later. So it got me thinking about how we are the sum of the decisions that we make, and that it was very important for world history that Gandhi did not decide to become a violinist. So later, when I was on trial as concertmaster in Durban, South Africa, I asked the orchestra if they could set up a meeting with Ela Gandhi, who is Gandhi's granddaughter and living there. And fortunately, the meeting took place September 14th of 2017. And I asked her about this episode in her grandfather's life, because I actually, at the time, I thought it would be neat not only if someone wrote a concerto for violin and orchestra about the life of Gandhi, but it should be premiered on Gandhi's violin. Well, she said that he sold it before leaving London, and there would be virtually no way to trace the single sale of a single violin by a young student in London in the late 1880s, which is unfortunate. So I gave up that idea, but I asked her permission to have this piece composed. At the time, I thought perhaps someone else would write it, perhaps a composer of Indian background. And she said, sure, as long as you include his 2 favorite hymns, or bhajans, which are Vaishnava Janato and Raghupati Raghava Rajaram. So I thought that was a very lovely condition, and so agreed. But the composer I had in mind, who's a friend of mine who went to Juilliard with me, she said she would charge $20,000. And that put me back at square one, because I don't exactly have $20,000 in my pocket change. So the piece had to wait for the pandemic, in which time I realized that that Ela Gandhi was going to turn 80 that year on July 1st of 2020. So I thought, well, I should write this piece or it won't get written. And I'd like to give it to her for her 80th birthday. So what I did, June of 2020, I took basically the whole month and many hours every day I spent composing. I decided I did not want to base it on his autobiography because there might be, it might be difficult sometimes to sort out the important decisions of a person's life analyzed by themselves while they're living it. So looking online, I found these two wonderful biographies of Gandhi by Ramachandra Guha. This one is the first half of his life, early years in India, student years in London, and the 22 years he spent in South Africa. And then this biography is the second half of his life. And they're both wonderful, wonderful, fascinating books. I highly recommend reading them. And with this idea of looking at decisions in mind, I read through the books, taking notes of what I thought might be key decisions that I could base a movement of music on. But then, even though I felt reasonably confident based on 4 years of living in Afghanistan, about 5 trips to Pakistan, and 1 extended trip to India in 2015 when I taught at Zubin Mehta's foundation in Mumbai, I thought I really want to get this right. So I'm going to have a lot of Zoom conversations with my former colleague from Afghanistan, Abhishek Adhikari, who is now, at the time, he was back in India, back in Kolkata. So we had a lot of Zoom conversations, and out of those conversations, it was possible to figure out for each movement how much should I involve the traditions of Hindustani classical music. So the first movement, the first decision that is looked at in this piece, the first movement is called SS Clyde to London, and it relates to how on September 4th, 1888, Gandhi sailed to London, despite the fact that he had met with the elders of his caste, Mod Banya, and they had all told him that it's forbidden for members of our caste to sail on the ocean, the Kalapani. If you do so, you will be outcast and you will be dead to us, and anyone who speaks with you will actually be fined. And he listened very respectfully to them and then went to London anyway, and which I think was a hugely brave decision that many young men in his position, especially his father had passed away by this point. I think many young men would not have made that decision. So in that first movement, you don't hear a lot of Indian music. You hear a trumpet fanfare that I use throughout the piece. It's taken from the Vaughan Williams C Symphony, and that trumpet fanfare is always representing the British every time it occurs. The scale in the first movement, it's from F. So. So in Western classical music, we would just call that Lydian mode. It's a little bit like Rag Yaman in Hindustani, but there aren't that many references to Hindustani music in that first movement, because this is a time of Gandhi's life when he's certainly more open to having a Western outlook than a lot of the people around him. In fact, you see this. This is an early photograph of Gandhi on this book in his suit and tie. And it's really actually in the second movement when he starts to very consciously and intentionally reclaim his Indian identity. Because as his granddaughter Ela explained, this idea of buying a violin, it was part and parcel of, he also took dancing lessons. He took elocution lessons. And he decided that, as Ela put it, his granddaughter, he wanted to be a perfect English gentleman. And then he decided, no, this is not for me. So the second movement is called Selling the Violin. And it's designed to be incredibly difficult for me because I want anyone who hears it to think, yeah, maybe it's a good idea to sell that violin. And speaking, and I had this idea that also it should make a reference to difficult rhythms, difficult ragas. And so Abhishek Adhikari suggested playing around with rag I hear by Rav. Which he also said has an association with a cowbell, so you'll hear a cowbell in the percussion section. Third movement, this is the first time I follow Ela Gandhi's instruction that there should be an inclusion of Vaishnava Janato, because the third movement is inspired by how when he was hired to go to South Africa, defend the interests of the Indian community there, he could have done just that, but he chose to also be very intentional about how he would live. And so for the first of many times in his life, he founded an ashram. This was the Phoenix ashram. And so the third movement takes its inspiration from this idea of different faiths coexisting, because one of the things you had to do at the ashram was take turns in leading prayer services. And he had Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, and Islam all represented at the ashram. So in the third movement, you hear Vaishnava Janato, but you also hear the Christian hymn, Lead Kindly Light, which we know is one of the hymns that was sung at Phoenix. We hear the clarinet referencing the Islamic call to prayer, and we hear the trumpet referencing the Jewish shofar, and then all of these four religions blending and mixing together. Fourth movement, Hartal. Hartal is a word that is not as well known today because Gandhi in his newspaper didn't like it and wanted to have a contest to determine the word that would replace it. And as a result of that contest, he arrived at the word satyagraha, which is considerably more famous. Had it not been for that contest, perhaps the world would know the word hartal a little better. Hartal meaning withdrawal. And so the first ever satyagraha, or hartal, was called a date that has more resonance now, September 11th, but of 1906. The first one involved the Indian community in South Africa agreeing to go to jail if necessary to avoid an unnecessarily onerous and difficult new registration law to which they were subjected. So the third movement, it's in 7/time. Again, the fourth movement, Hartal, I chose a difficult meter, again, to represent these challenges. The rag is pilo, and the violins of the orchestra represent the Indians in South Africa, and they play for exactly half of the movement and then stop. And then you hear the brass representing the British interest in South Africa getting a little bit agitated. The solo violin continues for the whole movement because the solo violin is representing Gandhi, perhaps explaining why people are seeing Indians peacefully going to jail instead of, which is again is represented by the orchestral violins not playing. The fifth movement is in Rag Yaman Kalyan. It's only for the violin and harp because it represents Gandhi's decision to only wear clothes that he made himself or that were made at the ashram where he lived, because that way you deny the British income from the tax on clothes that are sold. And so in the fifth movement, the harp represents the spinning wheel. The sixth movement, Chauri Chaura, is perhaps the most tragic. It refers to an incident of February 8th, 1922, when followers of Gandhi became violent and burned alive 23 Indian policemen who had been working for the British. When Gandhi finds out about this, he is devastated. He has a hunger strike because he said, if we're going to become independent through violence, I don't want any part of it. So he actually called a halt to the independence movement he was leading for about 8 years because he didn't want there to be violence. The seventh movement, which we're going to show you now, is the longest and the most mammoth. It refers to the Salt March. In 1930, he and his colleagues agreed that they would make salt, which protests the British tax on salt. And some of his colleagues said, well, that's a perfect idea because very close to the ashram is a place where we can make salt. And Gandhi said no. He said, we're not going to do the easy thing and go next door. No one will pay attention to that. We're going to walk 140 kilometers to the sea. And as you can imagine, if one of your friends suggested walking for 140 kilometers, there was a fair amount of protest internally, but he was very stubborn and insisted, and he was right, because the international media did, in fact, start paying attention to this mammoth walk, which, as it continued, attracted more and more people. By the end, the New York Times was there, and sending the New York Times to India was considerably more difficult in 1930 than in 2023. And in this, Abhishek was particularly helpful because I knew that from the biographies, actually, it's mentioned that during the Salt March, both Raghupati Raghava Rajaram and Vaishnava Janato were sung. In fact, there's a place in the seventh movement where I combine both of these hymns as though to represent that in one part of this mammoth group of people, they're singing one hymn, and in a different part, they're singing the other one. And so my question for Abhishek was that, to really give this movement structural heft and weight, there should be a traditional raga that is associated with this, and which one would blend best with these two hymns, which is actually a very complicated question because neither of the two hymns is based on the exact same rag, and yet I'm asking him for a third rag that somehow would complement both of them. He suggested rag Gara, and one reason for that is that it has this beginning motive which repeats a lot, and he said the insistence of that motive could sound like the stubbornness, if you will, of Gandhi. So since we don't have the other musicians of the orchestra here, what I thought I would do is sort of recreate, Dibyarka and I, we did this once, just about a half hour before all of you got here, and I thought we'd sort of recreate that conversation and that experience of that first rehearsal. So you'll just have to imagine the other instruments. This is very informal. At some point I'll probably sing what the other instruments are doing, and I'm a terrible singer, so you will not have to put up with my singing on Saturday or Sunday. But so what we're going to do, Dibyarka, is essentially the piece starts with Raghupati Raghava Rajaram twice through, and after that, then we go into the rag Gara, which will be with the teen-tall rhythm.
Tune check. One thing with classical music, there's always tuning involved.
Oh, yeah. And neither of us play in the first four measures, so I'll try to imitate what the orchestra does. should explain, though, the seventh movement doesn't actually end there. That's and that might be an issue in the concert because people will start clapping. That what happens next, because I wanted to sort of flash forward. So from the Salt March, 1930 to 1948, the year of Gandhi's assassination, and so the very end of it, what you hear if you come on Saturday and Sunday, suddenly that very fast music, it reaches its climax, and there's almost complete silence, and then the violin plays from Raghupati Raghava Rajaram. And then the strings have this very soft minor chord, and then the violin sort of representing the ascent of Gandhi's soul. Because of course he was cremated in keeping with tradition. So the violin does this ascending melody that's based on Rag Gara. And that's actually how it ends. So, thank you. Now, at this point, I think we would be very grateful to receive any questions you might have, either about our process of collaboration, about the piece, or about the blending of different musical traditions.
When you were approaching the Bach, how did you determine what rhythms to play or which places for more emphasis on?
That's what I was hearing. We didn't really have an extensive rehearsal for this. He kind of just, when we met 45 minutes before you all walked in for the first time, as in for the very first time we met, and we were waiting for them to set up the stage and all of that. So we were just mentioning what he might play. That Afghani folk melody I was familiar with, he had mentioned that he might play that, so I, of course, very familiar with that. And then this piece, he was saying, let me experiment with this one a little bit. So that's what I was hearing, just an improvisation, basically. So, yeah.
And I would add to that one of the things I admire about the preparation that is required in Indian classical music, it's such intense preparation. I'm sure maybe you've experienced this or witnessed it, that a sitar player or a rag or a rubab player is someone playing a stringed instrument. They'll come to a concert and say, my tabla player couldn't make it. Is there a tabla player who could? And they can do the concert with no rehearsal, which is mind-blowing to me. But a tabla player is simply required to have a level of training that makes that possible. Whereas for virtually all Western classical musicians, unless you're talking about maybe Joshua Bell coming in with the New York Philharmonic and doing a Beethoven concerto without any rehearsal, that's possible, yeah. But in most cases, it's just not going to be possible. And I really admire that. I think that's pretty extraordinary to be able to go in and do an entire concert with no rehearsal, because both people understand the structure of the music. They're both used to this very active form of listening in the moment, not just listening to, okay, what did I practice? How do I reproduce what I practice? But listening to the act of performing to the point that no two performances of the same rag with the same two musicians are going to be exactly the same.
I was kind of hearing a fast six, which you probably detected, and sometimes it was 2/3 and sometimes it was 3/2. So I was going back and forth, basically corresponding to the flow of the piece. That's what it's. Yeah. Yes, please.
So for the theme tell, why is the ninth one you're waving?
Let's find out, right? So here's what's happening in the first 8 beats. What changed? This boomy sound went away, right? So this is actually what we call, what we're showing with the wave is called a khali. And khali in Hindi means an emptiness or void. Can you feel the emptiness there? All of a sudden that boomy, filling sound is gone. So expressing the void, yeah. Yeah. Very good question. Very
Great question.
Great question.
And is it, teen means three, right? Because it refers to the big beats that are felt.
The three claps.
Yeah.
Teen, tal, short for tali, which means clap. Three claps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. Yeah.
That was another question.
Oh, that. Wow, she's very astute. She's asking sharp questions. Beautiful.
Very good.
Future musician.
Yes. Yes.
So we never had to use the four that you taught us.
So-
When we did the clapping with the 4 beats.
Yes.
No, we did use it. It's just another way to think of it is that the claps are, if you think of it as a group of 4, it's 1, 2, and 4. The 3 is when you don't clap. Da 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 da. And then
3 claps, yeah.
There's 3 claps, but
there's
when
a
do they
wave in
occur?
between, yeah.
There's like a rest or a pause in
Yeah.
between.
Yeah. 4 bars. Yeah, altogether. Yeah.
Sorry, you-
Please.
I was just wondering, as a Western musician, how is it okay to think of that as 4 bars of 4/4, or do you want to break free of that at some point?
Yeah, I mean, it's that's certainly a way to think of it and conceive of it. It's just that I think that what Dibyarka is doing, particularly in that demonstration, was spectacular. By the way, it's you do start thinking in groups that are not bound by that kind of thinking, and in a way it goes back to what I was talking about this difference. How in Western music we have this sense of beats as like vertically imposed from above, and I wish we could get away from that, because even within Western music, I try to tell my students that you shouldn't play as though there's like some evil scowling teacher beating your hand with a ruler on every beat. And some of my students, that's how they play, as though there's like this relentless externally imposed beat. And I don't think that the greatest musicians within Western classical music actually play like that. They play in a way that the sense of rhythm is generated and feels inevitable internally. And they are creating that sense, and that's why I was always struck by going back to what Paul Zukovsky's assistant told me he was doing 21 years ago of removing the bar lines from Schubert minuets. That even when we're playing Bach, Schubert, Mozart, Beethoven, sometimes removing the sense of a vertically imposed beat can be so helpful. And I remember another memory from 20 years ago. I was studying with Ilya Kahler, a fantastic violinist who's the only person ever to win gold medal in Tchaikovsky, Paganini, and Sibelius international competitions. And I remember him playing for me once the melody of the slow movement of the Beethoven concerto. And it was just absolutely free. And yes, he was playing it in a rhythmical way, but there was no sense that he was thinking inside his head, 1, 2, 3. So I think in all kinds of music, we should free ourselves from that sort of tyrannical sense of a metronome. In rhythm, it has to be exact and precise, but to come internally. And Teen Tal, yeah, when you first look at it as a Western classical musician, yes, it feels like it's in 4/4. But if you start freeing your mind from that concept and listening to everything you can do if you don't think that way, your music making becomes, I think, much more organic, much more natural.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. When you're, the way I try to explain it to to students of Indian classical music is when you are, the difference between a student and a performer of my level and those we call maestros. If you're thinking about 64 BPM, how that translates to Teen Tal. So that student is thinking 4 cycles of Teen Tal, 64 BPM. they're looking at each beat individually, and then there might be some layering going on top of that. By the time you get to my level, you can think of that 64 as 32. Or even down to 12, or other interpretations of that span of time, whatever time it takes. And then by the time you have a maestro, they can look at that whole thing as one unit of time. What that means is that there's absolute freedom and fluidity on how they're expressing that span of time. It's not really transcribable. My father has a lot of jazz students who love to transcribe because it's a very important musical practice. I do believe that. But then they're trying to transcribe something that he was showing, demonstrating, and they're coming to me like, what exactly is the time signature? You're like, is it 2 1/4, or is it 3 4, or 5 8, or you're gonna go crazy trying to figure that out, because that's not where he's coming from. He's not thinking about it that way. You have a stretch of time, and you can feel free to do anything within that. So it becomes very, very freeing in that way. Yeah. I don't know if that.
Yeah, absolutely. Any more questions, please? Yes.
Okay, so Mr. Harvey, I have to say it's very impressive, your work and your passion when you play. I'd like to ask, you have composed, I think I just Googled it, more than 50 works. How do you think this particular work is different from the ones you composed before? Which work is sort of you like most?
Well, it's a very personal piece, this one, for a lot of reasons. It's I think that, the time I wrote it, during the pandemic, it allowed a more intense focus, perhaps, than I've had while writing other pieces, and this very meaningful meeting I had with Ela Gandhi, and also just a sense of referencing back to my time in Afghanistan. Although oddly enough, even when I finished this in June of 2020, the National Institute of Music in Kabul was still standing. Students were still taking classes. They were still recording songs until the morning of August 15th, 2021, when the Taliban took over. So, at the time, there was no... I think no one was thinking that in little over a year that this would all have collapsed. But... there are just so many personal references for me in this that, I would say it's a very meaningful piece. But also in the pieces that I've written since then, I was just telling Dibyarka, I include more influences from Indian music, even in pieces that you wouldn't necessarily hear and think, oh, that sounds like a rag, because I like this idea of putting a meter like 6/4 and saying, okay, I'm going to write the whole piece in 6/4, and I'm not going to change the time signature once. How do I create a sense of rhythmic freedom? How do I return to that feeling of 6 after having left it? And that's something very profound that I think we can get from Indian music, is that sense of freedom. And sometimes, Western classical music, starting with Stravinsky, has had a lot of meter changes, and that can create this magnificent feeling of instability and of constantly being unsure where the beat is coming. And Stravinsky does it brilliantly. I would never take away from that. But I don't want to do what someone else has done better than I ever could. So as a composer, I often think, well, what if in my other compositions, I also allow what I've learned from Indian music to influence me, but even in compositions that don't have an obvious connection to India, because I think that there are universal truths implied by this horizontal cyclic idea of rhythm, truths which transcend any culture. This idea of leaving your moorings, leaving your foundation, but somehow at a subconscious level you never actually left it, and then you return to it, and that's like returning to the song. It's like, for me, for instance, I just had this strangely powerful experience. Earlier today, I went to the Arts Council of Princeton for the Princeton Symphony's Listen Up project, and I suddenly realized it was my first time entering that building since the previous time, which I think was in 2015, and it threw me because a lot has happened in my life that we don't need to get into since then, and I found myself thinking, what if I could go back to that previous version of me who last entered this building, right? So it's like, from that concept from Indian rhythm of returning to the psalm, it's like returning to a previous version of ourselves, or the cycle of the seasons, a certain date on the calendar, the earth going around the sun going around the center of the galaxy and completing a cycle. So yeah, to answer your question, I like this piece. Yes?
What happens when you meet the Princeton Symphony and start working with them? Can they just read from the music, or do you have to have a session like that?
That's what I was asking him. I was under the impression that they had been working on the piece already, but apparently tomorrow is our first rehearsal together. So.
No, I mean, I wrote everything is written in traditional Western notation. Here's the score for the piece. And the parts should be readable to everyone in the orchestra. But actually, shortly before we started, I think, Eric, you were asking me a good question about, well, is the tabla part written out? And I knew I wouldn't have to, because with a wonderful tabla player like Dibyarka, I just verbally describe what's going on. And you just heard the second time that we went through this together, and actually it was pretty great the first time. So that necessity of having everything clearly written out. In fact, I bet you that another violinist could perform this in 50 years, I hope, fingers crossed, and get together with a tabla player who's never met me and has never listened to a recording, and simply, play a little bit, show them the score, and if it's a good tabla player, he or she would be like, oh yeah, I get it, and they would be able to, maybe not quite as well as what you just did, but they could adapt to that in a way that not every Western classical musician.
Yeah, I was telling him because 6 months ago he had just sent me a very basic scratch recording, MIDI. Would you say MIDI? Yeah. And as soon as I heard it, I was like very reassured, because you could tell within the first 30 seconds this is someone who's studied Indian classical music in depth. Right, so what that means is he's composing from a place of understanding how Indian rhythm works and Indian percussion works. We're going to have a sitar player joining us for this performance who's also never met him. We're going to meet him tomorrow, and then we're going to rehearse tomorrow, and how he blends into the fold. I think it's going to work out beautifully. Yeah. Yes.
When you play the tabla, do you have different compositions like dagina dagina te te or da 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 da, like that you can put in when you feel it?
That's clearly a tabla student speaking. Have you studied tabla? Of course you have. Of course you have. How long have you been studying?
Like 3 to 4 years.
Beautiful. Yeah. So you know the answer to the question you're asking. Yeah. We have what we call repertoire, body of compositions for tabla. Yeah, it's absolutely. I didn't really go into that here because compositions for tabla don't as much apply to our discussion and music. But yeah, it's a very, very rich tradition, the classical music tradition in India. For percussion especially, it's very, very compositional based. We learn over the course of our training, which can be, spend, if you're serious about it, minimum of 2 decades. You're learning hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of compositions. And the way I learned it, which is in the traditional way, is without any notation at all. So it is an oral tradition, and you internalize all of those compositions. And it's a beautiful, beautiful process. With melodic music, compositions are very much important. But what you're learning for the majority of the time is how to establish the essence of a raga and how to improvise melodically within the framework of a raga, which is also there for our music, for our percussions. Teen Tal is such a simple construct. How can I bring out 20 different interpretations or shades of color, you would say? And then another few years later, you're expected to bring out 50. And then another few years, another 60, right? So it starts to look more and more, the borders of Teen Tal keep expanding, if that makes sense. So that by the time you get to your 40th year playing this music, it seems like, oh, it's such a huge blank canvas. I can do anything with this. But yeah, he was also asking me about tabla solo, which is a presentation that would be where you would typically hear a melodic reference point just like that. That's keeping the cycle, and then I would just play for an hour or an hour and a half. The body of compositions that I have inherited from my musical lineage, which is to say my guru, his gurus, passed down through the centuries, oral tradition. It's a very, very unique thing. I'm so glad you're learning tabla. It's definitely my favorite instrument. I hope it's yours as well.
So I think we've come to the time to thank you both for what has been an absolutely extraordinary hour of